Thanks, Kate. It is absolute pleasure to be here. You folks are so lucky to live in a place like this. I arrived, I took a overnight flight, or actually a same-day flight from Copenhagen to Oakland on Tuesday. And then, so, you know, you're completely spaced out of your mind, jet-lagged out of your mind. And then the next morning you wake up and you walk out to Fisherman's Wharf and am I in, you know, a movie here? I mean, what is going on, right? And I've been here before, and I think in some ways this feels like a paradise, and then you realize all the challenges that you're facing because of where you're located and because of the kind of vast economic restructuring that is going on as you move from one kind of economy to another kind of economy. And then you realize that what this organization does by focusing on the connective tissue between public, private, civic, university, community is so fundamental. So it's an absolute pleasure to be here. I think this is a critical moment for this region, really to take responsibility for its future, working closely with the new governor. It's great to have Lenny here, but really driving your future from the bottom up, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. So everything has changed, right? Everything is changing. We feel it every day. Economic insecurity, cultural anxiety, the pace of technological innovation, which obviously has incredible benefits, but is disrupting whole sectors of our economy and potentially leading to some enormous job losses in the near future. And when you have this kind of change, which we had at the beginning of the 20th century, you will have a populist reaction, right? I mean, this is just historically predictable. So the election of Trump in 2016, Brexit in Britain, the rise of the populist right in Northern Europe, particularly in places like Sweden and even in Germany. I mean, this is the cycle we're in, and this is what the media focuses on day in, day out, particularly if you're on Twitter. But there are other structural changes at play in the world today, and that's what new localism is about. And the title that Jeremy Nowak and I chose was very focused, right? The new localism, how cities, communities can thrive in the age of populism. Because there are structural changes in the world today that are really diminishing the role of the nation state and elevating the role of the city state. And that's because the federal government and even state governments are just governments, right? And they operate in sort of a mid-20th century kind of mode, very compartmentalized, very specialized, very bureaucratic. If you have an issue, a challenge, say transportation, where do you go? You go to the Department of Transportation. If you have a housing issue, you go to the Department of Housing, whatever it's called. Cities, counties, communities are not governments, they're networks. They're public, private, civic, university, community, hospitals, healthcare, labor, right? All co-governing the future of their places, many times through organizations and intermediaries like this. So there are structural changes in the world today, and it's not surprising that the city and the metro is the focus, right? Because what is the role of spatial concentration, which is basically what cities and metropolitan areas are? Increasingly, the centers of global innovation and productivity are highly concentrated in cities and metropolitan areas, because for all respect to Steve Jobs and the other tech wizards in Silicon Valley, innovation occurs from that seamless interchange of ideas between mature companies and research universities and startups and scale-ups and incubators and accelerators and community colleges and so forth, right? So cities are places where density can occur, co-location, concentration, agglomeration. When you have innovation that is distinctive to a place, right? Think about what the raison d'etre of this area is. then you can have economic opportunity. Then you can have the growth of quality jobs, good wages, good benefits, right? Ultimately, you can take advantage of your diversity. Probably the greatest strength the United States has is our diversity, right? Because that allows us essentially to innovate continuously for different markets, both domestically and globally, right? We weren't the British Empire, right? But we have the ability to reach the entire world because of our diverse population. And then finally, sustainable development. When you grow smartly, right? When you grow in ways that are connected by different modes of transportation, that are taking account of climate change, that's all gonna happen increasingly from the bottom up, right? The days of waiting for Washington are over, right? And the days of thinking that everything can be solved in Sacramento are over. That is really a 20th century perspective on the world. 21st century will be, already is, the rise of cities as the vanguard of problem solving. So what this book is about the shift of power in the world. There's definitely been a shift of responsibility, right? Really in the past 40 years in this country, if you're thinking about major issues that affect the United States, increasingly responsibility for being the vanguard of problem solving has shifted downward on our system, not just from the federal government to the states, but really from states to cities and municipalities and counties and metropolitan areas, and you feel it every day. So what that does is enable, the positive side of this, is enable continuous innovation, continuous experimentation, but also, oh, there we go, interdisciplinary responses. Again, if you go to that Department of Transportation, right, for decades in the United States, we have a congestion problem, widen the road, right? You go to a local area and you say, we have a congestion problem. Well, maybe we should be thinking about where housing is located. Maybe we should be thinking about where jobs are located, or the mixing of housing and jobs. Maybe we should be thinking about congestion pricing. Maybe we should be thinking about technological solutions. The solutions are different when they're bottom up because you're building from different sectors, different disciplines, different experiences and expertise. That's why this is structural. It's not just cyclical. It's not just because we elected one person to be president or a different party to run the Senate. This is structural change. So new localism, from our perspective, is a governing philosophy for the 21st century. It's not like the old system is coming back. You know, a lot of times when I read about the 2020 election, you know, and I worked for President Clinton and I worked for President Obama, I really get the sense that people think, oh, when the Democrats come back in, we will solve choose your favorite problem. That's not how the world works anymore, right? And unfortunately, when you have that kind of thinking, everyone in various parts of the country will say, okay, we'll just check out for 2 years. And then we'll wait for, you know, Senate Bill 197 or something to suddenly deal with our housing crisis or deal with the climate problem or choose your other famous issue, right? No, we need to basically accept that the power is in this room, right? No one knows this region better than you folks. No one has a better sense of what your opportunities are, what your challenges are, what your capital looks like, right? And what the potential is for a 2 + 2 = 5 effect when you're all working together. So we think new localism is the 21st century way of operating. In the United States for sure, but increasingly all across the world. And when you have bottom-up solutions, ultimately what that means for national and state governments is we'll reverse engineer the policy changes that happen at higher levels of government because it'll be based on the experience and expertise at this level. So if you believe in new localism, what you look for is not that perfect federal policy change. Now, I worked at the federal level for 10 or 12 years. I loved it, I enjoyed it. A lot of my friends are still in it, right? But you don't look for the perfect law or the perfect rule or the perfect administrative guidance. What you look are for norms and models. What you look are for first mover cities and communities that are inventing a new way of doing things, that then you have a group of fast followers that are adapting it and scaling it and replicating it and adopting it, and then it becomes the routine. It becomes the norm. So we went looking for growth models, governance models, and financial tools, right? That was the hunt when Jeremy and I started to write this book. So let me just tell you 3 stories, all of which apply to this place. One of which, and we'll see if, we can take a test to see which one you actually think is the most applicable. But they all apply here. And I think they challenge you to step up in some interesting ways. So the growth model. Let's go to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. How many people have been to Pittsburgh? Quite a few, quite a few. Gorgeous place, right? I mean, along several rivers. I mean, you come out of the Fort Pitt Tunnel and you see this site, and it's just glorious. But this is what Pittsburgh looked like in the early 70s. It was the capital of the steel industry for the United States and the world. My father's sister married a guy from Steubenville, Ohio, who was part of the Pittsburgh supply chain. So I literally would be taken to JFK Airport at the age of 7, put on a flight. Remember those days when you'd have to go through TSA? Put on a flight, and my aunt would pick me up at the other side. And then I would not be able to breathe because I would be in Pittsburgh, and I never saw the sky. The sky was like orange because of the steel factories, right? Well, that ended literally overnight in the late 1970s. Tens of thousands of jobs lost overnight. What our chapter on Pittsburgh says is the beginning of Pittsburgh's resurgence starts here. This is 3 Mile Island. Remember the 3 Mile Island disaster for some of you in the room. Well, a lot of the companies that own this nuclear facility were based in Pittsburgh, like Westinghouse. So when the nuclear disaster occurred in 3 Mile Island, all these Pittsburgh companies were trying to figure out, A, how do we assess the damage? And B, how do we clean it up? And they came up with all these schemes in the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars, which would have bankrupted the companies. Eventually, they said, we need a better way. They went to this guy sitting on top of that contraption. His name is Red Whittaker. He's still alive. He's in his 80s. He's a total brainiac. He's one of the first roboticists in the United States. So he was at Carnegie Mellon, and all these companies come to him and says, we need to assess the damage in 3 Mile Island. What do you have? He says, well, I'm working with a bunch of these children crusade to figure out how to basically have flexible robots that we can move around to hard parts of a facility or bottom of the ocean to figure stuff out. This is the beginning of autonomous vehicles, essentially, right? So they go to Red Whittaker. He basically says, I could assess the damage of 3 Mile Island for $1 million, literally. So he was immediately hired. What this began is the location of Pittsburgh as the center of not just robotics, but artificial intelligence, autonomous vehicles, machine learning, next generation technologies that we literally didn't even have names for going back to 1979, 1980. And the reason why Pittsburgh is so powerful, which has direct implication for this place, is they have a naturally occurring innovation district in their Oakland neighborhood. That's where Carnegie Mellon and the University of Pittsburgh are co-located. And this goes back to the late 19th century, early 20th century, when we built many of our universities, our advanced universities, in the midtowns of cities. You go to Carnegie Mellon, you fall out of bed, you're in the University of Pittsburgh. You fall out of bed at the University of Pittsburgh, you're in the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center. Everything is co-located in the magic square mile, right? And that enables ideas to be shared very fast between the roboticists of the world, who speak a language that none of us can understand, and the rest of us, right? Accountants and lawyers and business marketing folks. I mean, it allows for research to be commercialized, for the market to be scaled, to be replicated. There's about 12 technologies in the world today that are going to come to fruition in the next 10 or 15 years. And when they do, it'll generate economic output about half of current global GDP. Pittsburgh's in 5 of them. 5 of the 12. Pittsburgh has a first mover position, not just because they started with Carnegie Mellon, but philanthropies and corporations and governments over decades invested in centers of excellence because they knew there was no going back to the old steel industry, right? They knew they had to keep innovating around technological innovation that they weren't even quite sure would have any commercial effect, but they knew they had to do it, and they knew they had to be ahead of everyone. So Pittsburgh's now sort of an it city. You know, if you're a millennial, it's a great place to go. It's a gritty city, right? It's an authentic city. It's one of the most exciting places for me, anyway, to visit in the United States or around the world. But here's what's really interesting. Remember the Amazon bake-off for the second headquarters, and everyone's throwing all these tax incentives at them? Companies, including companies in this region, broader region, are going to Pittsburgh, not because anyone's throwing tax incentives at them, because they have to be near the secret sauce. Smart faculty, smart students, smart research. That's 21st century economy shaping. It's not, you know, let's have a race to the bottom, you know, and just throw whatever our local resources are at these companies and please, please come here and don't hurt us while you're here. No, it's come here because we're really good and we're really smart and we have a great quality of place, and you're going to be able to attract more talent, right, if you come. So a city has to think like a system and act like an entrepreneur. Think about that for a second, right? You have to think across disciplines, across silos, across stovepipes, and act like an entrepreneur. Take risk, be nimble, be agile, adjust to change. Not what our national government does for the most part, but that's what cities do. And some lessons from Pittsburgh. You've got to go from being a rust belt to being a brain belt. Hard to do, but fundamental. You can't escape it. Those are the rules. You got to build on your historic legacy. You can't run away from what you were. You just have to be a 21st century version of yourself. Pittsburgh used to make stuff. They still make stuff. When you go to Pittsburgh today and you go to Robot Row, just duck because all the drones are flying around, you know, when you enter these companies. They're still making stuff. They're still prototyping. And it's essentially in their DNA. And finally, philanthropy matters. Because philanthropy in a country that basically just looks at quarterly earnings statements, right, where short-term thinking tends to dominate, philanthropies can think for the long term. What's your 2030 plan? What's your 2050 plan? Remember, Pittsburgh invested in 1979 in robotics. In 1979, they were doing this, partly, you know, prompted by the 3 Mile Island disaster. That's long-term thinking. So that's Pittsburgh. I think there are clearly issues or lessons to be applied. Indianapolis. How many people have been to Indianapolis? Okay, so a little less. But here's Indianapolis in the 1970s. I mean, basically like many cities in the US, population, jobs had decamped for the suburbs, and a good day on a Sunday were mostly men, I suppose, going down to the downtown and taking shotguns and shooting pigeons. That was fun in Indianapolis, right? Has anyone ever heard of Kurt Vonnegut? Yeah, so okay. So he actually grew up in Indianapolis. That may actually explain all his novels, right? I mean, totally surreal. I don't know what he was taking at the time. He would love that cannabis is now legal. But in any event, he basically said Indianapolis was for 364 days, you would play miniature golf, and then on the last day, you go to the Indianapolis Speedway. So this was a boring place, right? So the city leaders, corporate, civic, political, university, basically said, we got to restore the core. If you don't have a center, if you don't have a downtown, basically, you don't have the ability to grow your economy in productive, inclusive, and sustainable ways. So what they decided to do, and this was in the mid-1970s, was to become the amateur sports capital of the universe. It's a little weird, but we were beginning to formalize our Olympic movement at the time, and they basically decided anyone who wanted to be in the Summer Olympics would need to go through Indianapolis, right? Of course, we boycotted the 1980 Olympics with the Russians, but put that aside for a second. So they just started building facilities, like building sports facilities. In the middle of the night in 1984, because they had built a football stadium, which has really nothing to do with the Olympics, they went to Baltimore and stole the Baltimore Colts, literally in the middle of the night. Then they stole the NCAA from suburban Kansas City. So this was a city that had a clear cluster in mind, sports, and then just basically operated like John Dillinger on steroids. They just stole stuff from everyone, right? At some point, well, they also did this. They set up an Indiana Sports Corporation. So as they were thinking about which facility to build, the business leaders would sit with the philanthropic leaders who would sit with the mayor and the governor, and they'd decide collectively how to do this. So they began to get this network governance in play. At some point, they woke up and said, how much beer and hot dogs can you consume? I mean, because a sports path is a path to a low-wage economy to a large extent. So they began to ask themselves, can we move from basketball to biotech? Can we be a high-road economy? Can we actually grow jobs here that have decent wages and decent benefits for a broader citizenry? So they created this thing called the Central Indiana Corporate Partnership. It just grew out of the Indiana Sports Corporation. 60 CEOs, university, philanthropy, corporations sit together several times a year to help steer and steward the economy, right? The government is not formal member, they're partners of the Central Indiana Corporate Partnership. And they began to basically play out, given their starting position around life sciences, what do we need to do around research? What do we need to do around workforce? What do we need to do around trade? Everything that will come off a base of advanced economy, right? If you look today at the statistics, the first leading exporter of life science products in the United States, not surprisingly, is the state of California. The second, the state of Indiana. You get rewarded when you have networks that work together to basically steer and steward your economy. They reached into their pockets, big philanthropy out of the Lilly Foundation, large corporations, and they began to capitalize their own venture funds, their angel funds, their seed funds, sounds familiar to California, obviously. But then they also built the Indiana Biosciences Research Institute, and they said, remember when we used to steal stuff? Let's go steal faculty from around the world. So that's what they started to do. They started getting the best bioscientists to come to Indianapolis, and it's a pretty attractive place when you're there. High quality of life. Remember that crazy Amazon second headquarter bake-off? Well, Indianapolis was in the finals. And that was surprising to people. It wasn't surprising to folks who follow this, because Amazon smartly said, well, do you want to be in a place where you actually have leadership that can work on all the issues that obviously a 21st century company needs? So what's the sort of takeaway from this? Be an ecosystem rather than an ecosystem. When you walk into that Central Indiana Corporate Partnership meeting, you have a lot of serious people around the table running big corporations, big universities, big philanthropies. They check their egos at the door and they behave, right? They work together for the better part of the region and ultimately the state. They have mechanics of collaboration. When they walk into that meeting, they meet to decide, not to discuss. That's a different kind of mode for a lot of networked organizations. Because, even in this region, if you guys took a poll, what's your number one issue? Okay, housing, I suppose, but there's some serious issues around jobs, serious issues around infrastructure. Everyone has their own opinion, right? They're figuring out how to actually get a consensus on reality, right? And get some collaborative effort around certain issues. They work at multiple geographic levels. They're at the downtown, they're at the city level, they're at the metro level, and they reach all through Indiana because there are bits of the advanced economy in South Bend, Indiana, where Notre Dame is, for example, who do big data analytics, and they bring them into the Central Indiana Corporate Partnership. So they're very smart politically, very smart economically, and they are harnessing private and civic wealth. The US, and particularly California, does not have a capital problem. We have an organizing problem, right? We have an organizing problem, and they're harnessing capital and putting it towards collective benefit. A lot of lessons from Indianapolis for this place as you begin to mature this organization and begin to take priorities. Last piece is Copenhagen, Denmark. How many people have been to Copenhagen? This is going to be the bikers in the room, I suppose, but we'll see. This is not about cycling, okay? So just alert here. But we went looking for a place that was thinking about how to finance the inclusive city or the sustainable city or the innovative city in 21st century terms. We couldn't find one in the United States, and we wanted to go to Copenhagen anyway, but so this is a pretty serious place, right? It's about 600,000 people in the municipality. It's about 2 million in the metro. It's basically the size of a Pittsburgh or a Cleveland. It's obviously a global leader in sustainability. They are going to zero carbon emissions by 2025. I mean, serious place. You know, the C40 climate group, cities group, will be meeting in Copenhagen in October of this year. Nearly 50% of people bike to work or school. I mean, the biggest threat when you're, you know, a foreigner, and particularly an American in Copenhagen, you walk out of your hotel and just people whipping by on their bikes. So, you know, not for the faint of heart. And interestingly enough, because we have a cartoon about Denmark and Scandinavia, oh, these are just big welfare states, they're taxing and regulated. Actually, most of the power is local. Governance is highly decentralized in Denmark or in Sweden or in most of Northern Europe. Here's the issue. 30 years ago, Copenhagen was flat on its back. Manufacturing had left. The port of Copenhagen essentially had moved over to southern Sweden in Malmö, right? This was a dead city. And so the leaders of the national government and the city government, who were of different political parties, basically said, we need to make a big move here because we're going south, right? And that ain't good. They said, let's build a 21st century subway system, okay? Because we understand that density and concentration, agglomeration, and connectivity will be the future. So let's build a 21st century subway system, best in class in the world. Only problem, we're broke, we can't pay for it with taxes. So let's find a different system to pay for a subway. So they came up with this idea of a public asset corporation, right? So this is a publicly owned company, and they merged a lot of companies that already had existed. And it's a publicly owned company, but it's professionally managed. And what it basically did is took all the land in Nordhavn, North Harbor, all the land across the harbor, which the national government had owned, and all the land between the airport and the downtown, the Orestad district, which the military owned, again, national government. They put it all under the control of the Copenhagen City and Port Development Corporation, a public asset corporation. They basically said, we're going to let you sell or lease this land, get the highest and best use of it, and all the revenue, everything from land sale and land leases, will go to service the debt on this wonderful subway system we want to build. So we won't tax anyone a kroner, right? We're going to do it for land sales and land leases, right? 30 years later, what has happened? The Orestad district has become an innovation campus, right? A very large mixed-use innovation campus because of its proximity to the airport. And the harbor's been completely regenerated. But most importantly, all that public wealth that was generated, all that value appreciation went to build and service the subway. So if you go to Copenhagen today and you don't want to try to bike with the Danes, which again is a dangerous activity, take the subway. It's the easiest thing in the world, right? And again, by American standards, built without any tax dollars, right? So this forces us to think about a couple things. First of all, Jens Kramer Mikkelsen, the former mayor, then became the CEO. We're not here for a quick fix. We're here for the long haul. If you think about public assets in the US, generally what happens, we just sell off stuff because we have to meet, you know, some kind of budget deficit every couple of years, right? I mean, we get it, but we're not thinking about the long term. Other lessons. First of all, in Copenhagen, or in Germany, or in Holland, they know what the government owns. They value what the government owns. And then they dispose of those properties or buildings in ways that add to the public benefit. When I go to many communities in the US, they don't even know what the government owns because the government is local government, county government, the Port Authority, the Airport Authority, the Redevelopment Authority, the Convention Center Authority, the Stadia Authority, the Parking Authority. When I die, I want to come back as the head of the Parking Authority because that's where all the money is, right? So we don't even really know what the government owns in total. And even when we do, because try going to the Stadia Authority or the Convention Center Authority with the idea of let's take some of your land and use it for broader purposes, talk about a riot, right? So we don't even cohere or unify in the way that Copenhagen did. They merged public entities, tough to do, big reward for doing it. And then they have this public-private management model. So we think about PPPs, public-private partnerships, from the transactional level. They think of from an institutional level. Here's what the public can do. They should set the vision, right? It's their assets, it's their land, it's their buildings. They should set the vision, the broad vision for the future. But management should be done professionally because you can't have this politician or that politician from either level, national, local, saying, hey, I've got a deal for you. Let's sell that property to this concern. Not a good idea, right? I mean, let's do this in a professional way because again, at the end is the pot of gold, right? The revenue that services the debt on an infrastructure system or clean energy or affordable housing or anything that your community needs and wants. So how do you build a nation of problem solvers? Because again, the federal government is not coming back. I'm not sure it was ever there really, but you know, I mean, the notion that as Americans, I mean, this is a place where de Tocqueville talked about the cross-sector voluntary cooperation in the 1830s. We never really look up, you know, and say, we have a problem. Let's wait for Washington to solve it, right? That's not really who we are. To some extent, that's who the British are. That's why we got away from them, but you know, we're different, right? Our DNA is different. Very entrepreneurial, very chaotic, right? So how do we build a nation of problem solvers? Here's the challenge. For every Pittsburgh, there's dozens of cities subsidizing consumption rather than innovation. The next sports stadia that gets built in the US, it just makes me crazy. You know, I mean, billionaire sports owners coming to voters and saying, please subsidize me. It's ridiculous. For every Indianapolis, we do a lot of collaboration in the US, but it's informal. It's not really capitalized. It's really not structured. Remember Indianapolis. They meet to decide, not to discuss. Back with capital. Very different kind of operation. And then for every Copenhagen, we don't even know what the government owns, and therefore we don't have the ability to recognize public wealth that can be then leveraged for public benefit. Different model. So there's only really 3 questions you have to ask, and every place in the US is distinctive, right, as it should be, because of legacy, because of location, because of you know, smart moves or dumb moves, it doesn't really matter, right? What's your edge? What is your raison d'etre? Why do you exist? This place is very interesting. I mean, if I was an anthropologist, I'd be looking at, wow, this incredible ag sector, tourism, the military had a major presence here. You're now transitioning to something else. Now, either it's gonna happen to you because of your relative proximity to Silicon Valley, or you're gonna basically harness your future, set your strategy, and then execute. No one else will do it, by the way. The market, there's no planning in the market, right, writ large. Different companies will come here, won't come here. They won't care if there's housing or transportation, really, as part of their decisions. And the state, well, the state's got a lot on its hands. I mean, you know, California's 5th largest economy in the world. So you have to basically define your future. Who's in charge? You're all in charge. It's America, right? So you're all in charge. But instead of that leading to chaos and to no action, how do you collaborate to compete, right? There has to be structure to this. We're in a post-federal world. We're almost we've gone from government to governance, essentially. So how do you organize yourselves? And then finally, where's your power? A lot of the institutions we've inherited in the United States, public institutions, private institutions, are 50, 60 years old. They're looking a little sclerotic, right? They're not quite able to operate in this governance model, in this network model. So how do you begin to either take these lessons or other lessons and to adapt and apply? By the way, in Copenhagen, besides the City and Port Development Corporation, and the same could be said for Hamburg, same could be said for Amsterdam, same could be said for Stockholm. These are global cities that have huge housing pressures, just like you have, that have huge transportation challenges, just like you have. But they have a different response to housing and transportation, right? They have different ways of financing housing. They have different inclusionary zoning regimes. They have social housing providers that are actually in the market with tens of thousands of units. I mean, this is not a cartoon in Northern Europe. These are capitalists, but they have figured out a way to mitigate the externalities of a market on steroids, right? And when you're a global city, as all those cities are, and as this whole region is, you're affected by a lot of global capital flows that you need to bring under control. So understanding how the Northern Europeans operate, understanding how portions of Asia operate, that's how Americans need to operate. I mean, we can't be parochial when we're basically the 5th largest economy in the world. We've got to basically draw from some of these solutions in a world of problem solvers so that you can move forward. I think what we're developing now in the United States, there's no like memo from Washington that's basically laying all this out. If there was, we'd probably burn it. But in any event, I mean, what we're building is like a new class of metropolitan leaders. Some are public, some are private, some are philanthropic, some are universities, some are in the healthcare system, some are in the unions. We're environmental activists for sure. Like, we're operating across these multiple disciplines and sectors and building a class of leaders, right? Could be grass tops, could be grassroots, grass stems, to help power our places forward. And that's how the US is gonna roll for the foreseeable future, right? Do we need help from Washington? Yeah, we need them to set a platform for our own success, right? I mean, we need them to do certain things around healthcare or investment in R&D or infrastructure. We're still waiting for the infrastructure bill, right? We need them to do certain things, but leave the rest to us, because these are our communities. We're the ones who have that knowledge, that expertise about what are our distinctive opportunities, special role to play. So we are better suited, frankly, to harness the future, using resources perhaps or policies that are enacted at higher levels of government. So that's the new localism. I'm sticking by it. I wrote this book with a good friend. I think we were just pissed off, really, when we wrote it. But I do feel like what we've really sort of touched here is the zeitgeist of what makes this country in particular so fundamentally special, exceptional even in some respects, but also well-suited for a networked world. Thank you very much. Looking forward to some questions.
Thank you so much, Bruce. We're going to have